Welcome, my dear friends. It's great to see you again. I'm Stephen Clements, a writer, a gamer, and an appreciator of big brain activities in general. On this channel, I perform dramatic story readings, I provide role-playing game and movie reviews, and I get to talk to interesting people. And today we're back at this series where we're looking at a book written by an interesting person about role-playing games, and that is Gary Gygax, creator of Dungeons & Dragons and many other games, Role-Playing Mastery. This book has been quite a useful guide to me in my journey of enriching my experience and expanding my capacity as an enjoyer of the role-playing game hobby, and indeed of any sort of game. And in Chapter 5, we're going to cover a topic that he might know a little something about, because it's entitled Rules, Construction, and Reconstruction. And so Chapter 5 is a longer one, so I'm going to break this into 2 episodes just for management of my own voice and to keep this video from being an hour and a half long. So I'm going to read from the text and then afterwards provide my own thoughts, commentary, and review. And I'd love to hear your interpretations and opinions in the comments below. So let's get into it. Now that we have examined the human components of the role-playing game hobby and described what it takes for players and GMs to attain excellence as individuals and as groups, it is time to discuss the general framework within which participants operate, the rules of the game. In this chapter, you will learn about the major pieces that comprise any RPG framework, how they fit together, and about how pieces from different games might be combined into an entirely new and unique game form to suit the special needs and desires of a playing group. Providing structure. Technicalities aside, certain common areas must be accounted for in any set of RPG rules. The common areas are objective, time and distance scales, movement rates, combat, missile, and hand-to-hand, types of characters or creatures, technical data, and rewards. They provide the basic structure of role-playing games. These common areas need not be presented in any special order, although as given here, they do reflect the structure typical of military miniatures rules, the roots of RPGs. When the purpose of the game, its objective, becomes evident, the reader must be prepared to accept a tremendous departure from the objectives of other types of games. How does one win the game? Well, there is no actual winner. What then is the object of playing? To have fun, of course. You see, you can survive and become a master spy, a mighty wizard, or the head of a tribe. That all sounds pretty silly, and it is unless one considers the entertainment provided, the social interaction, and the educational value. That aside, it is important to know the objective given in the rules, if any. What is stated there is one of the major keys to unlocking the spirit of the game, as described in Chapter 2. The prosaic time and distance scales might seem technical, but are nevertheless fairly understandable. On a large-scale map, 1 inch might represent 1,000 miles. Yet in role-playing with one-to-one representation, it is common to deal with scales of feet, yards, or meters as well. The scales of time and distance tell you much of what is to be expected from the game. Brief time scales, 1 turn in the game equaling 10 seconds of real time, for example, indicate a highly complicated and time-consuming attempt at realism. A turn, for this purpose, is a span of time during which a player, character, or creature can take one specific action. Generally speaking, the more real-time 1 turn represents, the more play-oriented as opposed to realism-oriented the game is. Likewise, distance scales that do not demand precision measurement tend to indicate a game in which play, as opposed to realism, is emphasized. The movement rates given in the rules are directly related to time and distance scales, naturally. At least they should be. Movement might be separated into several broad categories according to type and scale. Large-scale map movement, expressed for instance in miles per hour or miles per day, should be given for when one is traveling from one locale to another. Medium-scale exploration movement, perhaps in yards per hour, might be included for activity of the sort indicated by the name. Finally, there is small-scale movement, defined in yards per minute or feet per second, when the participants' game personas are involved in combat or other close-quarters operations with enemy figures. Of course, basic movement rates are subject to modifications to account for circumstances. What about the terrain the figure is moving on? Are there any hostile creatures impeding progress? The reader must be able to envision such effects. If the rules are detailed with regard to movement modifications, much is said thereby about the aim of the game system. Participants are expected to be able to envision details of the imagined action and revel in the minutiae of it all. If, as with time and distance scales, movement is treated in general fashion, the game advocates role-playing in lieu of tactical details. Make-believe combat, whether of the lethal or non-lethal sort, certainly requires a suspension of disbelief and very active belief. Obviously, role games have much imaginary action. Were it otherwise, they would not be so popular. Whether it is combat by magic, an exchange of weapon swings between medieval knights, energy blasts from spaceships in titanic formations, or whatever, it must be explained and structured to allow for scale and movement as well as the effect of weapons. Whether it's a group of detectives about to bring a criminal gang to bay, colorful heroes in the comic book mold confronting supervillains, investigators of the supernatural uncovering a nest of alien monsters, or bold adventurers piercing the heart of a fantastic underground lair of evil, the core of the game is the combat between the player's characters and the non-player opponents controlled by the game master. Problem solving might well be required to get to the combat, and similar activity might take place thereafter. The whole adventure might be sprinkled with conflict situations not necessarily involving combat, but at the heart of the action, its most exciting moments must be related to combat of a personal sort. Rule systems that are virtually nothing but combat are, without question, not role-playing game systems. Those that relegate such activity to an adjunctive position are best understood as overemphasizing role-playing to the exclusion of gaming. The combat portion of the rules reveals an RPG structure for what it is. Some RPGs will stand as virtual battle games, some as abortive attempts at theatrical training. Ice cold! But most will lie somewhere in between. The manner in which players approach the challenges and opportunities of the RPG will be defined by the types of characters available for their use in play. Some games express the parameters of this activity by tightly defined professions, character types, or adventurers that can be played at. Others give far broader terms to define the player's game personas, but they then define the scope of activities possible through areas of expertise or ability, skills, or proficiencies. Whichever system the RPG utilizes, and there are pros and cons for both, the selection and development of the game persona modifies the game norm to a greater or lesser extent. The intent of the game and its rules is revealed to a considerable extent by examination of this area. If the objective of play is not clearly defined, a careful analysis of the approaches to play offered here will point the reader toward the spirit of the game. The author had an intent when the game was designed, and the revelation gained from a study of the types of characters permitted or suggested for play will discover much that is otherwise left unsaid. No matter what types of player characters are used in the game, conflict and interaction involving the PCs occurs through the use of opponent and neutral characters and creatures, collectively referred to as monsters. All or most of these beings are controlled by the game master. They can run the gamut from horrible-looking non-human animals, plants, and mineral creatures to humans who look and may even act very much like the PCs themselves. When monsters have human or near-human form, they may be referred to as non-player characters or NPCs. While there are some natural forces to contend with during the course of any campaign, rugged terrain, extreme temperatures, inclement weather, etc., these are minimal in comparison to the challenges that will be presented by the GM through his placement and use of monsters. Setting aside disbelief, the game participants must become thoroughly conversant with all characteristics of these beings. Whether mythical beast, robot, or something in between, it is mandatory to know your enemy. The powers given to opponent and neutral beings delineate the expected power and performance of the player's personas in the role-playing game campaign. Beginning player characters will be forced to contend with relatively weak monsters. Then, as the player's expertise increases and their player characters become more powerful, the GM will gradually stiffen the opposition by adding more powerful opponents. The opponent is surely the measure of the range of PC power within the game system. Just as participants must know their own capabilities with respect to their game personas, they must also know the abilities of the beings who will oppose them. A fly swatter is used for small insects, a cannon for behemoths, and in some cases the victory goes to the fleetest of foot. The nuts and bolts of the whole RPG structure are covered by the technical data area. How certain devices perform, how magic works, what psionic, mental powers actually are in game terms, what weapons do, and so forth all fall into this category. A large section of any good set of RPG rules will consist of technical data. The more removed from reality the genre of the game, the greater the amount of so-called technical data that must be given. When the author deals with fanciful material or facts obscured by the passage of time, space must be given to such material to enable participants to grasp the setting and play the roles of make-believe persons who are part of it. Thus, fantasy games must describe magic, mythical monsters, and so forth. Science fiction role games deal with aliens, unknown planets, advanced technology, and so forth. In contemporary settings, the game rules may assume that more background knowledge is available to participants. Therefore, technical data in such rules can be more limited, or else deal in greater detail with specifics aimed at highlighting some particular portion of play. Because a participant does not win an RPG in the traditional sense of the word, rewards in such a game come in the form of augmentation of the PC. The rewards for successful completion of a particular episode are defined in the rules and vary from system to system, but all have the general effect of making the player character more powerful and able to cope with bigger problems and more difficult opponents. These include monetary rewards, new equipment, more or greater skills, and enhanced powers, the acquisition of NPC followers or allies, increased status and rank or social position, and so on. In a rewards system, it is common to have several of these benefits, or most of them, in some mix. In addition to defining what rewards are obtainable, the rules will specify how they can be obtained. The ease or difficulty of gaining rewards indicates how rapidly one will be able to build a PC within the game. This, measured against the lethalness of the combat system and the powers of the opponents, tells the participant two things. First, it indicates how long he or she can expect to retain a game persona in an active state within the campaign. Due to death or to outgrowing the level of challenge, it is usual for a player character to end campaign activity at some point. In some RPG systems, death or dominance occurs too rapidly to allow participants to enjoy the game fully. A few are too slow to award increases, so there's no sense of progress or achievement. Second, it provides a way to measure the general rate at which player characters gain power. If PCs begin with relatively great power and tend to have few rewards, the game is either one in which problem solving is emphasized over role playing, or else one in which mortality of PCs is high. Whether or not there are additional features to the rules, the whole must be read, understood, analyzed, and applied by participants who expect to become masters of role playing. Life has many facets, and there are many approaches to it in different cultures. Role-playing games can be compared to life in this regard. The rules are the standards that are applied to game life. The game is the culture. Before one can operate successfully within a culture, it is necessary to know the standards. We are raised within a culture, so its standards are ingrained in us from infancy. The morals, ethics, and dangers are taught to us. Rewards and punishments modify our behavior. In similar fashion, the rules of a role-playing game attempt to describe a culture based upon an adventurous life of make-believe. The study and absorption of those rules equates to the real-life indoctrination we receive as we grow through childhood to become adults, and, it is hoped, gain the knowledge and ability to function capably and successfully within our culture. Adding flavor. In addition to providing the structure that enables participants to operate their characters within the game milieu, the rules of a role-playing game also describe the elements that give a certain game its particular flavor. To have a good chance of being exciting and enjoyable, and thus popular, a role-playing game must contain 7 major elements, with varying degrees of emphasis placed on each one depending on the intention of the author. The elements are these: 1. Wonder and fear. 2. Adventure and heroism. 3. Problem solving. 4. Role playing. 5. Combat, conflict, and battle. 6. Group operation. 7. Enlightenment and education. The first element, wonder and fear, underlies the popularity of the whole hobby of role-playing games. Fantasy, science fiction, and horror are the most popular RPG subjects, and these topics are certainly filled with wonder and fear. Wonder because the game world is different from our everyday reality, and fear because of our instinctive tendency to be apprehensive about that which we do not fully comprehend or understand. In contrast, a role-playing game designed around the everyday life of a librarian or a census taker, to choose a couple of absurd examples, would not be likely to infuse the players with an appropriate sense of wonder and fear. The element of adventure and heroism is present to a measurable degree in all role-playing games in which player characters are called upon to perform remarkable feats under adverse conditions. Fantasy, science fiction, and horror games all have this element, and it is present to an even greater degree in topics such as espionage, pulp heroes, and comic book characters. All of us enjoy problem solving. There's nothing like the sense of satisfaction we get from using our minds to solve or accomplish something, whether it's as elementary as finishing a crossword puzzle or as complex as designing the world's best role-playing game. Every good RPG contains some provisions for problem solving by the player characters. How does that magical device function? Which of the trees in that grove is actually a sentient alien life form? Is that friendly agent actually who he claims to be? Brute force is not always the way to achieve a desired goal, and a good RPG will offer player characters opportunities to use their wits as well as their weapons. Role-playing is fourth on the list, not because it is less important than the first three elements, but for symbolic reasons, because it lies at the center of what an RPG is all about. However, while it might come as a shock to certain people, role-playing is not the reason for the existence of role games. Role-playing is the vehicle through which play becomes possible. It is a means, not an end. Thus, the RPG might heavily emphasize role-playing, acting as it were, or the system might well focus on one or another of the elements of the game. This, in and of itself, neither adds to nor detracts from the work. The important thing is that the elements in combination allow the participants to enjoy play on an ongoing basis. One distinction must be brought to the forefront again here. Certain games claim to have a basis in role-playing, while in fact all they offer is an aspect of role gaming. These designs feature role assumption. That is, you are given a game persona. You do not create and personalize the character you are to play. Typically, the situations you find the character in are also prescribed by the game. Choices are limited, and gameplay will always be channeled and of relatively short duration. Do not be misled by claims to the contrary. Role-playing and role assumption are quite different. Multiple choice books are typical of the role assumption game designs. I am the co-author of 4 such books. Sagard the Barbarian game books, written with Flint Dilley. These works are fun and have all the elements of role-playing games except for actual role-playing. Even more than one person can participate, since the hero has occasional associates who can be played by others. Such books, along with far too many games, might deceive the participants into believing that they are engaging in role-playing. Role assumption is similar to role-playing, and it is good training for the more exacting and exciting play of RPGs. But it is a different and lesser game form, I believe. Conflict, combat, and battle are integral to all games. A role-playing game might stress 1, 2, or all 3 of these sub-elements. However, in an RPG, the opposition comes not from beings represented by other players, but from characters and creatures under the control of the GM. This fact does not prohibit conflict among players, of course, but it does discourage such activity. In a game in which conflict is more important than combat, outwitting and overcoming opponents is encouraged, and make-believe aggression of the physical sort is limited to the non-lethal variety. Any good RPG will make some provision for combat of both the non-lethal and lethal sort. Whether characters are using fists, clubs, rapiers, or guns, combat is on a one-to-one basis. That is, single characters contest with each other, perhaps one versus more than one, but each entity is but a single one for supremacy. Battle is large-scale combat involving great numbers of adversaries, and is usually reflected on a basis other than one-to-one for less powerful non-character creatures. A great stress on conflict is acceptable in an RPG, but if combat and battle are more dominant than conflict, the reader should examine the rules carefully to see if role-playing has been set aside in favor of role assumption. Worse still, the system might be a military simulation or a war game masquerading as a role-playing game. This is not to denigrate either of these types of games, for I personally play and enjoy both. It is pointed out to differentiate and define role-playing games. If one cannot define the subject matter, one cannot possibly expect to master it. Knowing how to deal with conflict, combat, and even large-scale battle can only assist in developing a broad expertise in role-playing games. It is crucial to understand what one is engaging in and put the activity into proper perspective. To engage in actual role-playing games requires at least 2 participants. One is game master, the other is player. Because RPGs are designed to provide ongoing play, it is necessary to have a greater number of players than 1 and desirable to have more than 2. Thus we come to group operation and cooperation, real or game prescribed, without unduly affecting the group operation and cooperation requirement. But when combat between player characters occurs frequently, Hostility among players is fostered, and long-term participation by player personas is threatened as a result. This conflicts with the nature of the whole genre of RPGs. They tend to be a social, peer group activity, and when the games stop being friendly, the playing ends and the group dissolves. The stronger the provisions within the rules for encouraging cooperation, the better the game. Again, it is worth noting that a desire for mastery subsumes the ongoing nature of the activity. To invest effort in a work that is internally geared to destroy itself is unwise. On the other hand, a game that is structured to absolutely prevent any PC versus PC conflict is likely to be so limiting as to give rise to serious doubts about the whole system as a choice for serious study. What is the best number of players for maximum enjoyment of a play session? The answer to that question certainly hinges on the particular game system used and also on the nature of the current episode in which the player characters are involved. As a general rule, one GM can manage 3 or 4 players while maintaining a high level of attention to all elements of the game. If the GM has an assistant, one who is knowledgeable and ready to do dice rolling, record keeping, and similar detail work, the group size can be doubled without unduly affecting the overall level of play. On rare occasions, 2 persons can be so well attuned as to be able to co-master a game. This not only allows a group of at least 6 to 8 players to be well entertained, but may make it possible for the player characters to divide occasionally into separate parties. With appropriate assistance, the co-GMs may be able to accommodate as many as a dozen or so active players. But if the number of players exceed 3 or 4 per master/assistant, then elements of the game must be sacrificed. Just as with teacher-student ratios in the classroom, individual attention is necessary to assure proper attention to each participant without overworking some and ignoring others. The system you select for mastery should be attuned to this. Last, but certainly not least, we have the element of enlightenment and education. The game system should, in and of itself, provide enlightenment. This applies to the correct and expert play of the game proper and also to the genre and the milieu in which it is set. Rules should provide a continuing learning experience in both areas, and by rules I refer not only to the main body of the work, but also to supplemental material provided or alluded to by the game's author. With this enlightenment comes education in the mechanics of the game, plus education in the genre and milieu. The latter, most certainly, will come only if the participant pursues study on his own. All RPGs should, in fact, encourage such study and provide information as to what sources can be consulted for this effort. Note that there is no reference in this passage to traditional educational values. While the play and mastery of role games will unquestionably broaden the individual considerably and add to his education, the pursuit of mastery of RPGs need not concern itself with this subject. It is probable that some work will eventually address itself to this topic, but this book will not. By examining the content and structure of the rules and how the rules address the 7 major elements of a role-playing game system, the reader can gain a sound grasp of the game. An understanding of the spirit of the work is brought to mind and nurtured, and a measure of what the work is and where it will lead can be made. It is necessary to have done all this as a firm foundation for masterful participation in role games. And then we get into defining parameters of play after all of that. Because this is a longer chapter, we're going to stop here for today, and we'll come back in the next episode to complete Chapter 5. But I think we've already got a lot to talk about here. Because defining what is your game about, I think has really come into the cultural conversation about Dungeons & Dragons in the modern age. Is the game about Dungeons and Dragons? Or is it about wish fulfillment, self-insertion, playing yourself using the game in fantasy settings? Or is it about writing up a character who is not you and trying to live and walk in their shoes in their fantasy world? And it's not controversial to say that a lot of the direction and the aesthetics and the sensibilities that are going into the D&D 5th edition seems to be focused on dragging people's real-world preferences and indeed their own identities into the fantasy game. I mean, just look at the artwork, and then look at Wizards of the Coast's barista adventure that they put on D&D Beyond. Who would want to play that? If you showed that to an AD&D 1st edition grognard who showed up to a game that was about going into dungeons, fighting monsters, and gaining treasure while not dying along the way, these are 2 entirely different sets of sensibilities and purposes. To repeat the great line from Keelan Halverson, D&D 5th edition, and so 5th edition, has become a game of Barbie dress-up with your characters. Races don't mean anything anymore. It's just a different skin that you can apply to your character, like in a MMORPG, which indeed was the objective behind designing 4th edition D&D and has steered some of the design decisions of D&D 5th edition, so Hasbro can get folks on that virtual tabletop and hit them for every microtransaction they can get. Whereas back in the day, when Gary and company were coming up with the original Dungeons & Dragons games, it never occurred to them. They even thought it was ludicrous to think that people would want to buy adventure modules and game world settings from TSR because a lot of the fun comes from making it yourself. Why would you want to pay someone else for something you can do yourself for free? But in that regard, I think that they had a lot to learn, because just because they knew what you could do with the game, because they're the ones who wrote it and had more experience playing it than anybody in their consumer base, people need to be shown what it is you can do with this thing. What is this game about? And so that's what the value of those original modules were. And unfortunately, the excellence in writing was not the primary focus of D&D 5th and 5th edition, from what I can tell, because it has some of the worst writing I've ever seen, such as the campaign book, Baldur's Gate: Descent into Avernus. That is the single worst written thing I have ever read. And believe me, I've read some shit. And indeed, the best 5th edition module that most people will name is Curse of Strahd, a rehash of a decades-old module from those early days. And it had different sensibilities than kick in the door, fight the monsters, and get the treasure. It incorporated more problem-solving, time management, and objective clearing, along with role-playing, than your typical dungeon kicker. Whereas the more recent adventure modules, at least from Hasbro, have been more spoon-fed, follow the path. We're not going to try anything that creative, but here you go. Now, this isn't to discount a couple good things that 5th edition put out, like Lost Mines of Phandelver was very good, but it was a harkening back to an other school of adventure design. So for the games you're involved in and those that you're considering being involved in, look for what is the game about? What is it designed for? Because my own beloved On Guard is about social climbing in Three Musketeers era Paris, France, and everything in it is geared towards that. And all the supplements me and Pat and others come up with is to help augment that experience. But it was originally designed as a vehicle for a very clunky dueling simulator that wasn't really a game at all. It was a protracted guessing game where chance really didn't have a whole lot to do with it. It wasn't very gamey, and I brought that up in my review. But by the time you get done adding on all the window dressing elements to give context to that dueling system that they wrote the game for, all the rest of that is so much more interesting than the dueling system. So the writers had a vision for what they wanted the game to be about, but then it got overwhelmed by these other elements. And the World of Darkness games, incredibly role-playing centric. And conflict of personal natures and tribal natures, very important to that game. And so conflict and relationship management with the other player characters and with the NPCs is at the heart of that playing experience. If you don't like that, you will not like this game. So Vampire, not really made for the superheroes with fangs aficionados out there, whereas D&D 5th edition is meant for the solo video game experience seeker that just happens to be played in groups. That's what it's designed for, and that's why so many of the classes are designed to be one-stop shop. They don't need anybody else to press ahead. Whereas in earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons, that's where the stereotype came from. You need a fighter to stand in front, and you need a cleric to stand behind him to keep him alive. And oh, by the way, if the fighter goes down, the cleric is the backup fighter to keep the wizard safe, and somewhere sneaking around is the thief trying to get a backstab on anybody. Oh yeah, and the wizard, or the magic user, is supposed to be lobbing magical death down at people as hard as he can go. All these classes needed each other. All those players needed each other. All the races you could pick from, it made a difference in game which race it was. And so by 5th and 5th edition, blurring and then eliminating that distinction, you actually have a less meaningful experience playing one of these races. But 2nd edition went into great detail on different races and what their cultures were like to help the players assume the role and explore different aspects of it to make a richer game experience. Differences make a difference. And I want to get back to that first element in adding flavor, wonder, and fear, because I'm going to gripe a bit more about 5th edition. First with Spelljammer and Planescape, where the cosmology was taken away from You have these planets, galaxies, solar systems, and these crystal spheres, and they're surrounded by this unknown element, the phlogiston. And it's incredibly dangerous to travel on your Spelljammer ships between these different destinations. There's all kinds of untold horrors out there and things you just can't understand. Even the gods don't understand. That has built-in mystery that the books don't resolve for you, and your own frame of reference in this life can't resolve for you. So there will always be a sense of wonder and awe and fear, because you as a biological creature is going out into this unknown expanse that the greatest of sages don't understand. And it's incredibly flammable, so one wrong move, you're all torched. That's amazing. That's wondrous. But then worse, in 5th and 5th edition, you get the elimination of the crystal spheres, so everything's just this one big soup in the cosmos. But they also take away the planes being separate realities from our own, entirely different layers of existence whose laws don't have to operate by ours because they're effectively different universes. And instead, they're just destinations you can sail to if you go far enough through the astral sea, which the astral plane used to be its own place of wonderment and amazement, or a backstage of all creation where you can find crazy stuff beyond space and time. But now it's just, we're just going to sail this way and eventually we'll get to the 9 hells. So think of all the wonder that has been taken out of the equation just by doing that. And fear, the removal of evil as an objective concept in the Dungeons & Dragons game, makes a difference, because if all your opponents are just morally gray people who disagree with you about something, there's nowhere near the level of threat as there is in knowing that they are objectively, incurably evil, and now you're the good guy, they're the bad guy, and the cosmic drama, the clash of those two cosmic moral forces adds drama to the game right off the bat. But 5th and 5th edition, they've done their best to kiddie-proof the whole game. That's why it's so hard to die. That's why the monsters don't hit as hard as the players do, and on and on. So these were design decisions made to coddle their players. Whereas the earlier editions, save or die, buddy. Save or die. Some days just weren't yours. And in a game, if you can't really lose, you're not going to get the satisfaction out of playing it. So these things are incredibly important to keep in the game, to make it an interesting and compelling game. And by Wizards' own research, they claim that most campaigns fall apart by 7th level. Well, a lot of people speculate that's because the sense of challenge goes away, so the sense of reward for accomplishment doesn't really exist, and people get bored and want to try something new. Not really a surprise. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. And so that's why I don't play 5th or 5th edition if I can help it. Now, I will at cons, and if there's nothing else to do, sure, I'll jump in on that. Because playing with other people is more important than my druthers. But this is why I have an affinity for earlier editions and games like Castles and Crusades, and games that deliver on premises that speak to me, like On Guard, Vampire, Mage, Call of Cthulhu, all that kind of stuff. So what do you think? What are the kind of games that you're really interested in? What is it about them that hooks you? What were they designed to do, and why does that feed your soul? I'd love to hear about it, so please drop it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, I do appreciate likes and subscribes, and let's keep the conversation going. Share it with your friends. So my dear friends, that's what we got for now from old Gary Gygax. And until next time, I wish you nothing but the best.